Hi, I'm Dr. Selina Matthews, spiritual psychologist, and I want to welcome you to Soul Transformation. My guest today is Dr. Zaman Stanizai. He's a professor, a scholar, an author, and a Sufi mystic. Our topic today is the God within from a Sufi perspective. We are going to have such a fascinating conversation today. I can't wait to talk to Dr. Stanizai. Please join in. Dr. Stanizai, very excited to have you here. I want to start by asking you, can you begin by clarifying the difference between Sufism, Islam, and their relationship to the Quran?
Thank you for inviting me. Um, every religious tradition has two sides to it or two dimensions to it, the esoteric and the exoteric. The exo is the outer, the public, the social. As we humans all wear masks, of course, that's for our social identity, whatever religious tradition you belong to. You present yourself in a certain way in society through your prayers, through your etiquette, through your clothing sometimes. That's your social identity, so social come religious identity. But the esoteric is the essential, as it comes from the Latin word es, being, the beingness, and that deals with what it really means. That's when you are uh, presenting yourself, your inner self, without any concern for the society and for others. And here you are trying to find yourself and the divine, or yourself with the divine, or the divine within you, or in some other form. In other words, that is the very essence of that very first, the very important question that almost every human being asks at the very, very beginning. When we start talking, there is a point in time when we wonder who we are. And we often ask our parents, where do I come from? And of course, the parents never, almost never give children the credit for the depth of the question. So they answer them in a very superficial way because they think that what does a child know? But I think that children know a lot more than we give them credit to. So that part of it would be uh, the very essential, the very beingness of a person, and how the person relates to the totality of existence. So that is in Islam. That second one is called Sufism, and in many other traditions, in Judaism, it's called Kabbalah. In Buddhism, it's called Zen. In Christianity, it's spiritual Christianity, and almost every tradition has that inner part of it, that inner knowledge, the inner exploration.
Yeah, that's a very exciting part. And I'm going to tie it to our next question, which is what is the Sufi perspective of the God within?
Um, this is a question I've been exploring within myself for quite some time. I think the concept of God, the way we understand it generally in most societies, is an obsolete concept. I think when Nietzsche said that God is dead, um, some people perhaps thought that that was such a blasphemous statement. I agree with him 100%. Yes, God is dead. The traditional God, the God of the eons that we have been exploring, worshiping, loathing, and doing all sorts of things with, the God of our perception. Um, I think humanity has evolved and has reached a stage where we have to. I'm sure it's very difficult to recoin the word, but we can at least recoin the concept if we can. In other
That's a good-
words, to understand God in a way that it is not this old man up there somewhere in the stratosphere that is very angry, vengeful, wrathful, and all that, where whatever terrible thing happens in nature, we attribute it to the, say, the anger of God and all sorts of things, which are, I think, basically the reflections of how we human look at the metaphysical. And I think the word metaphysical by itself is troublesome in a sense that in the Western concept, the metaphysical part is the extension of the physical. In other words, it's a very human centered perception of reality where things start with us and our senses take us to a certain level. And when they fail or wherever their limitations are, where it ends there, that's where the meta part begins, the metaphysical part. Whereas in the Islamic perspective, um, it's first of all not a human-centered perspective. So the word meta doesn't apply. Um, so things do not start with humans; they do not end with humans. It's a jumble of realities. Part of it we understand through our senses and emotions, and that is the physical, because our outer five senses that we mostly agree on, those are geared towards placing us in the context of that physical world. However, the metaphysical, again, with the proviso that the meta doesn't mean beyond, that is entangled with that other beingness in the sense that it's all one and the same. We understand certain things through our outer senses, and we understand certain other things through our inner senses. And in it, we have a place somewhere in there, but we do not necessarily have a centrality in that placelessness of ours.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered the question, but the point is that when things are kind of mixed like that, the boundary between the human and the divine blends. Um, Perhaps
So
there is no boundary.
there's an intersection place. Is that what you're saying? There's an intersection place where the God and divine, or the human and the God, or the human and divine connect?
Again, maybe even the connect is an obsolete word in the sense that we don't know where we end, where the human ends, and we don't know where the divine begins, because we are so conditioned by our physicality that there has to be a boundary between those two. However, in the inner world, there is no such a thing. I might add that the equivalent of the physical and the metaphysical of the Western tradition in Islam, we call that meta part, we call it alam mana, the realm of meaningness or consciousness. And because it is non physical, it defies, by virtue of its very definition, any boundaries. So we could say that, the human is as much divine as divine is human. And that makes the God of the Quran a very interactive God. And the God of the Quran speaks to us in terms of using words, Fazkuruni azkurkum. You remember me, I will remember you. And this is God talking to human. And when you talk about revelation, I don't think there's any greater revelation than this. When God is addressing humanity in pretty much equal terms, in pretty much exchangeable terms, um, and you can almost feel a sense of pleading in there. So the remembrance is not to use the memory per se to remember me, like who I am, rather to be in the consciousness of you and I uh, being one. When we talk about the absolute oneness of God, the Tawheed Mutlaq, in that sense, uh, we don't accept an entity for ourselves. And a great Sufi mystic, Halaj, was persecuted because he claimed that I am the one, I am the divine, I am the truth. And of course, the society that was at that time, we are talking about 1200 years ago, the society was not prepared to accept that, because we were still thinking, or at least they were thinking, in the sense of this the connection, this boundary, this separation. So when you're in the alam ma'na, you are ma'na literally means meaning, but in reality, it is where meaning forms of the archetypes, where there is an essence of beingness to which we have to relate based on the degree of our understanding, the degree of how we approach it. So, like when you see someone, let's say if you're walking in the desert, there's someone walking towards you. You have no idea who the other person is. And we wonder, but you rarely ask yourself, who are you in relation to that entity out there? Because that's what, you each reflect of the other, a beingness that you assign to yourself. But being so egocentric, um, we we never ask who we are. Remember that question I referred to, the very first question of our childhood? Because we are shunned, we are ignored so badly, we rarely ask that question after that. And then we go to the other side of the equation and say, well, who is God? Where is God? And all the rest of it.
Yeah, but we are always in a process of becoming. So who we are as a child and who we become and continue to become grows throughout our lifetimes. At least we hope we grow, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I hope
You
so.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, the process is, nothing is static. Is what you're the point you're making. Everything is on a continuum. If you can choose, some people get stuck and they spin their tires in different ways. But divinity or consciousness, I think you're talking about both of those things. It's a choice and it's a movement, but it's never static. Is that sort of what you're saying?
when we talk about God, we I'm talking about the Quranic God. God is spirit, and the word for spirit is ruh. And ruh means that which flows, like the wind. And this defines beingness as a living beingness. In other words, nothing is dead. Everything is moving, because that flow gives them their true entity. So whether it's the flow of spirit, the flow of wind, of water, of let's see, even you can go inside atoms and the electrons and protons that are dancing. Nothing is static. It's just that the human perception has its own limitations, and we cannot slow down certain movements that might be too slow. So a snail might be dashing in its own world, 100 miles an hour, but because the human perception does not understand movement in any other way other than that which we humans are programmed to. So, therefore, we think that a snail is moving slow. And in that sense, We don't even see movement. It's oftentimes when we see something moving, we see a thing moving, but we do not see movement itself. So that in itself is a flow. That flow is the divine. That flow is life. That flow is spirit. That flow is our beingness. So nothing is static.
Well, exactly. I'm with you on that, and it is a choice. It is a choice whether um, it moves easily or people are pushed. It is a choice, don't you think? Do you think
Yeah,
divinity is a
I had an inspiration once here in the Santa Monica Mountains. Um, I was coming down from a hike, and there was a stream of water, and I sat by a tiny little waterfall that probably fell down maybe less than a foot or so, and I just observed the flow of that waterfall, and looked at it from one perspective, that this happens only one time, and you can't reverse it. And the other thing is, well, if it happens once, can we enjoy it? Well, if you want to enjoy it, you have to be able to observe it, to see the beauty of how this water comes together, and then falls. And then it just occurred to me that no, there were two things flowing. There is the water that flows from an upper place to a lower ground, and then there's a perception of humanity, me as its representative, that there is time flowing. So because I operate in a flowing time, I do not see the reversibility of the water going back. In fact, the water may be going back and forth, and it could be stopped at anywhere, um, not to stop the flow, but to observe it and enjoy it. So we are in the midst of so many fluidities that our physicality conditions us to see things only in a certain way at a certain time and no more. I think if we have that potential, our imagination may help us once in a while. I wrote a piece of composition on that, but that is beside the point. But the idea was that yes, there is a transient moment in that flow of water, which is us, and and that we have to cherish that, and that could be the best way to worship the divine in the flow of things.
Yeah, that's a really exquisite image. I will remember that one for sure. Just really beautiful. I think the imagery that you presented just clarified so many concepts that you were talking about life, about the divine, about humanity, and being in the here and now, from a different tradition. But the here and now is being present, and that's in all traditions.
Yeah, for me, that has been etched in my memory in a way that I think that I felt my divinity in that moment. It was a
Yeah.
moment um, uh, of a very very spiritual connectedness. And when you are thinking about like now and here, um, we owe it to the beauty of the English language. When you put the word together, now here also can be read as nowhere. But that's the linguist in me that jumps somewhere else.
Well, that's a brilliant linguist, that's for sure. So I'm going to move on and I'm going to talk about, we talked a little bit more about Sufism and Islam. Is there more differences that you want to share about that, in terms of in the separation or the connection between the two?
I think when we talk about Islam, of course, it depends, as in the case of any religion. Um, it depends on an understanding, a particular understanding of a person, of a group of people, of a society. And that's why we have sectarian differences and interpretive and all that. But for the most part, there is a scripture, there is the Quran, and some of the authentic, and I must emphasize the word authentic, sayings and traditions of the Prophet that kind of holds it together. And then, of course, there is the society that celebrates things like prayers, like going on a pilgrimage or fasting, or many of the other rites and rituals that every other traditional community, every other community of a different tradition would also have. However, when it comes to the mystical part, which is Sufism, uh, the very word kind of defies a peculiarity that is common beyond an individual person. However, yes, there are traditions of various regions in the Muslim world, like the subcontinental Indian versions, the Central Asian versions, the North African versions, the so-called Middle Eastern versions, the Persian versions, and so on. And I think there is the evolvement of a Western version, where Western European and Americans who have reverted to Islam and then have found a place in the mystical tradition rather than in the conventional one. So there are a whole lot of that. One other thing that I think holds Islamic mysticism together is the poetry. After the reference I made to Halaj, the man who was persecuted because he claimed, I am the truth. Um, uh, a whole genre of poetry developed in the Muslim world, where through the use of allegories and metaphors and all that, it provided people with with an excuse or with a place of refuge. That whenever they got in trouble, so if they referred to the divine as the beloved, which is pretty common in the Muslim tradition, in the Sufi tradition, the divine beloved with a capital B. Uh, then, if they got a little bit carried away and people tried to question them, they would say, "Well, it's just a poetry. I wrote it for someone I love, a human person, rather than a divine person." So, this poetry, as I said, in a way, solved a lot of problems. In some ways, we have Sufi poetries where the divine beloved is described in pretty much, if I can use the word romantic, in very romantic terms. And I must add, not necessarily not sexually romantic, but romantic in the sense of the intimacy. And God Almighty refers again. We can contextualize that in the verses of the Quran, that God is the lover and the beloved at the same time. It depends on which role are you playing at a certain moment. So there are times when you are the lover, God is the beloved, and there are times when it goes the other way around. As I said earlier, since we are invited into a dialogue by God Almighty, then we must understand it in both of those ways, that it is reciprocal, interchangeable, exchangeable, and more than all of those, it's a more interactive divine.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, who does not know the incredible poetry of Rumi? We all do. Even the youth, talk about it, and that's incredible. There's one question I want to ask you. There's actually two. One about the five pillars uh, if you can just briefly talk about that. Because in one of them it's purification. So the five pillars, I'll let you speak on that, and then specifically talk about the purification rituals that are really important to Sufism and Islam.
Um, the five pillars are not necessarily universally agreed upon, but largely they are, for the most part. And they begin with the declaration of faith. And that has two parts. The first one is there is no God but God. And this, unfortunately, is not understood in its true sense. Prophet Muhammad came to end religious tribalism. And so, therefore, when the word Muslim was used, a Muslim means one who surrenders. And the one is not defined, it could be anyone. However, from historical documentation and from the Quran, of course, if you read it correctly, and by that I mean the way I read it, is that all of those, anyone who believes in one God is a Muslim. Uh, and that could not be just human beings of different faith traditions and different cultural traditions, but nature, plants, vegetation, animals, everything. Because, in a sense, um, the divine, the Quranic divine, is a flow of, for lack of a better term, the flow of energy. And this energy whirls like in a whirling dervish, like in the cosmic whirl. Wherever you see, things are whirling. And you go with that flow. And so long as you're within that flow, you are a muwahid. You have accepted God. You have surrendered. You have become a Muslim. And whenever you fall out of that flow, um, just to imagine it in a physical sense, like, if it speeds up and you lose control, when you go out of that flow, you break with nature. And the idea there is that you come back to it. The coming back is called tauba. And tauba means returning to the flow, rejoining the flow, and becoming part of that whirl. Now, so in that sense, a Muslim is anyone who believes in one God. And here we are talking about the unicity, the singularity, the mathematical oneness, as well as the totality and the wholeness. And that doesn't leave anything outside of the circle. So, first, you have to believe in this. And then the second part is to believe that Prophet Muhammad was the last of the messenger. Um, so, most people would blend the two together. And then, for political reasons or for some other reasons that are lost in history, these were both kind of reserved and made exclusive to people, to the followers of Prophet Muhammad and those who believe in the Quran. Whereas the declaration of faith is clearly in two parts. There is no God but God. That's part one. And the second part, and Muhammad is God's messenger. And this was an attempt to make sure that human beings sort of give up on tribalism, on tribal religion, on defining a religion in a cultural sense, or defining God along with it in a cultural, in a geographic setting. So the universality of that God is not geographic, it's not national, it's not racial, it's not even global. It's not even cosmic, it's paracosmic. It's the paracosmic totality of all things. That is the God we are talking about. And in it, in that field of energy, of the paracosmic totality of all things, which is what I would call Tawheed Mutlaq. In it, we are a particle and we flow with it. So that is what will make you a real mu'min and a real Muslim when we do the two parts of it, which are often referred to as shahadatain in the Arabic grammar. There is a dual form in addition to a singular and plural. Then you move to a kind of cross, and we are not talking about the Christian cross. It's a cross that connects your beingness to two poles, a vertical and a horizontal. The vertical one is the aqimus salat, is to connect with God. And again, traditional people think that this means performing the daily prayer, salat. But the word salat comes from the word wasla, salawa wasala, or have the same roots in the Arabic grammar, and therefore it means to connect with that divine. And so this is your vertical pole. And right next to it, and almost inseparable, is wa'atu zakat, and give to charity, give to others, share what wealth you have. And so when you read aqimu salata wa atu zakat, it is the emphasis on those two polarities, the vertical and the horizontal, that you have to connect with the divine. And as you do that, you have to connect with the humanity. You have to be with them in their pain and in their pleasure, in their happiness and in their sorrows. You have to be human with them. There are no requirements for being a human, and therefore there are no requirements for how to connect with them. It doesn't matter whether they come from Ukraine or from Afghanistan or wherever. They don't have to come from anywhere. They are where they are. Make sure that you reach out to them, either in the physical sense or in the spiritual sense. And then it moves to the fourth pillar, which is fasting. And the fasting, again, it is, I don't want to sound arrogant, it's often misunderstood. Uh, Fasting is to understand that you, as part of that totality of being, have been endowed with so many gifts, with so much beauty, with so many uh, uh, things that nurture you. Uh, and it gets to a point where you often take things for granted. And so fasting is to stop that for a moment, to deny that to yourself. For instance, if you're a wealthy, rich person, you may never know what hunger is unless you experience it yourself. So during the month of Ramadan, you stop eating. And it's only then when you understand how much you have had that you may or may not have been grateful for, but now you are. But it doesn't have to be food. It could be like sometimes I walk in my rose garden and I look at the rose and I can't smell it. I deny myself the smelling of the roses because I enjoy it. It's only then when I realize that just having the sense of smell and the sense of sight, so therefore it's denying yourself things that you have taken for granted to create and strengthen awareness within you that you're so interconnected with the totality of things in nature. And at the same time, you're so dependent upon them that unless you became so arrogant and so self-centered and thought that, well, you have it, forget about the rest of the world. No, things can disappear in the blink of an eye. So that is the fourth tradition. And in it, people do certain rituals, prayers. During the 30 nights, the whole Quran is recited. And if you can imagine, for instance, with each time zone, when time for the evening prayer comes, people read that very same chapter of the Quran, that section of the Quran. So that one section of the Quran is being recited by everyone, say in Indonesia, New Zealand, and Japan, and then the next hour it moves to Thailand and China, and the next hour. So in 24 hours, Muslims around the world recite that in their prayers. So we move to the fifth one, and the fifth one is the performance of the pilgrimage. And this again was an idea where all humanity is invited to one spot, regardless of who they are. Again, my interpretation is that the chapter on pilgrimage in the Quran, uh, well, let me clarify that. Quran addresses things, certain things, God addresses it directly to Prophet Muhammad. Certain other things are for the community of the believers, and that's probably meant those who believe in the Quran and Prophet Muhammad. There are certain other things that are addressed directly to the Muslims, as I defined them earlier. So that may include Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and all that. But then in the last set, things are addressed to humanity at large. Ya ayyuhan nas, O human beings. Now, there is no distinction of male, female, black, white, gray, whatever. So the surah on pilgrimage is addressed from the beginning until the end to humanity. And my interpretation is that God invites all humanity, or at least those who can afford it, physically, financially, and otherwise, to come together once a year uh, to a certain spot on earth, so they can converge, and so they can understand each other's problems, find solutions for the problems they have, and so on and so forth. And I think the Muslim world earlier on benefited a great deal from this, because in every year during the Hajj, people came, for instance, when Muslims from China came and they talked about paper, the rest of the world might have been saying, like, what is paper? What are you talking about? They didn't know what paper was. I think in all of Europe, there were only 18 volumes that were written on papyrus, because paper was not anywhere there. So once that news came to the Muslim lands of, say, Central Asia and the Middle East, then it spread like wildfire, if I can use that analogy. And in a short time, it reached all the way to Spain and to the Indian subcontinent, along the east coast of Africa. And with it, all the knowledge and the discoveries that Muslims, because the Muslim civilization was the dominant civilization, so these were shared. So, in a sense, it was a conference, uh, or it is a conference where people should come, share their wealth, spiritual, educational, whatever, as well as their money and all that. So that is the fifth pillar. And I think there is a story of an African ruler who was so I mean, rulers are rich and wealthy, and that he had a lot of gold. And when he headed for Hajj, for the pilgrimage, he wanted to make sure that he cleansed himself. And so he gave away the gold as he was going. He wanted to make sure that when he reaches Kaaba, the cubicle in Mecca, that he is not distinguished from any other pauper and poor person. And they say that the stock market, or rather the equivalent of the stock market in Cairo, Egypt, collapsed because there was so much gold given away. And so the idea is that you have to resort to an impoverishment of the belongings, the things that you're connected to in terms of wealth, power, and all that, that you get connected to a spiritual world. And symbolically, certain of those traditions are carried to this day, like on the day of the pilgrimage, the king of that land, which in our times is Saudi Arabia, the king comes and sweeps the floor of the Kaaba. again, it's symbolic, but the idea is that for all humanity to come together. But the problem is that, unfortunately, in spite of all the clear guidance that's in the Quran, even the Muslim world has, or the Quranic Muslim world, they have become tribalized, probably in more ways than they thought they would, but they have.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to our next question because we're running out of time here. I'm going to go to the story of Adam and Eve and how that is depicted by the Quranic perspective versus the Christian perspective. Can you speak on that?
For one, it's the biblical version of that narrative that is prevalent even in the Muslim world, unfortunately. So, in some ways, Muslims are more Jewish and more Christian than they think they are, because they are not referring to the Quranic version. In the Quran, there is no Eve. That word is in the Muslim culture, as I refer to Eve or Hawa, but the Quran doesn't have an Eve, and the reason it doesn't have an Eve is because Adam is both male and female. It's androgynous, and it's Adam as a representative of humanity, the quintessential human being. Um, and in a way, it works in two sets of in a sort of two creation stories or dialogues. One is the story of creation, where the equivalent of Lucifer or Iblis, and Iblis means that who covers or conceals the truth, whereas Lucifer comes from the word light. So it's Iblis and God that sort of plays on Adam, on the human being. In a way, when I say play, I mean they determine what this being ought to be. Whereas in the story of the Garden of Eden, it's almost the other way around. It's Adam in its essence of both being a male and a female, is trying to play on what the role of God and Lucifer ought to be. And so when Adam goes to the tree, the forbidden tree, the idea there is that, and when God addresses Adam in the dual form. Again, the Arabic grammar I referred to earlier. So that would represent both genders. So God addresses Adam. It's like, didn't you know that you were forbidden from approaching that tree? And Adam responds not in singular, but in dual, again saying, we, the two of us, did it unto ourselves. Forgive us. Which is very different from what Lucifer or Iblis did in that first story, because when God reminded Iblis, didn't you know? And Iblis says, out of his arrogance, say, look, I'm made of fire and this being is out of earth, so I'm superior to it. So Lucifer answers out of arrogance. But here, Adam answers out of a sense of submission and surrender and accepts the responsibility for the action it did. And I refer to Adam as it because it includes, I think that's another beautiful word, the pronoun it in the English language that's inclusive of both genders. So Adam, the androgynous Adam says, we did it unto ourselves and take the responsibility. And so, therefore, there's no left rib in the Quran as it is in the Bible. There is no Eve in the Quran as it is in the Bible. There is no responsibility, gender responsibility that, the woman did all the terrible things and they are the ones who put us in all this trouble, whatever. None of that exists in the Quran. However, as I said in the beginning, when you go to the Muslim culture and you ask about Adam and Eve, they will retell you the biblical version word by word as if it were in the Quran, but it's not in the Quran.
That is so fascinating. I am so thrilled we got to talk about that because it's fascinating, and it has so many psychological implications. Me being a psychologist, and metaphors, it's so rich. Looking at it from that perspective, that's a whole other conversation that we could have another time. But wow, that's incredible. Where I want to go to is our final question, and it's a long one, so I hope you're ready for this one. America and the world at large is in an intense transformation. From a Sufi perspective, where do you think we are heading? And is there hope for America, the world at large? What do you see from your very unique, very brilliant
Well,
perspective?
if I told you America and the West are very, very backward, they are behind, they are underdeveloped, it would sound ridiculous. And in a sense, it is. The problem is that the Western world, has traditionally not been able to manage the two sides of the equation in terms of the mythos and the logos. So it is the dominance of one often at the exclusion of the other. So if the mythos took over, the logos, reason and logic went out, and if the reason and logic came back, then the mythos went out. So we are in the last phase, or in the most recent phase since the age of enlightenment, which would have to be questioned in terms of the reference of the word, is that we have become so rational and so over rational that the spiritual part has become totally irrelevant in our sciences, in our technology, in our daily life, in our cultural view. And so, in a way, the Age of Enlightenment would have been good because it got rid of the various suppressive theocracies that were created. Yes, but the point is that it threw like the baby with the bathwater, and it's all gone. And so the West experiences a lot of deprivation. That spiritual part is gone. The rational part of it is good. Now, that's why, in spite of all the development, people in the Western world are trying to find a connection with that world that is missing from theirs. And that's why they turn to Buddhism and sometimes to Islam and to many other religious traditions, to many other cultures, to find their place, because that which they had themselves, Christianity, had a terrible background during the Dark Ages, and they can't separate those. The West, uh, in terms of its technological advances, there is no question. I mean, where we were and where we are now. I mean, we literally are there on the verge of, if I use the word conquering a little with the little caveat there, that they are literally conquering the outer space. So there we are there. However, that spiritual part of it is missing. Now, the Muslim world in particular, since we are talking about Islam, they were when they were at the helm in terms of the global civilization, they developed both sides parallel. So Islam was not xenophobic in denying, let's say, Greek tradition, Greek rationalism, to be used along with, like reason and revelation together. Why not? or certain Hindu traditions, certain Zoroastrian traditions. So Islam was very receptive. That's why Islam had a very good, healthy childhood. So it didn't deny itself the other ways of approaching and understanding and interacting with God. And it didn't have to be all just revelation. It didn't have to be all the Quran. And that's why they developed so many sciences. Many of the sciences that we know today, thanks to the Muslim civilization. I mean, algebra, logarithm, chemistry, alchemy. I mean, when you line up the sciences, they come all from the Muslim world. Now, at this point in time, of course, the Muslims are lagging. And again, this is probably the sad story, is that um, the Christian theocracies, when Christians had theocracies, the Muslim world had none. They developed human rights uh, that we champion now. They developed like the separation of power. They developed many of the other concepts of the separation of state and church. All these come from the Muslim tradition. However, in the West, they are called Western democracy. And once you put that label on it, people in the Muslim lands kind of show sensitivity towards it and consider it a foreign thing. And sometimes I said, well, why don't you read Ibn Khaldun and then tell me the Declaration of Human Rights and tell me which one is not in there? Why don't you read Al-Mawardi, for example, who talks about the separation of power, the executive, legislative, and all that? It's all in there. However, because of this labeling, and now most Muslims have resorted even to Christian theocracies, theocracies similar to the Christian theocracies of the Middle East, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. These things have no precedent in the Muslim history, no precedent whatsoever to have a theocratic state. And yet, nowadays, they do it because they think they have to be different from the Christian Europeans. So they are kind of going back to it and becoming sort of what is it? Ultra conservative religious communities. And in the process, since most of these governments are operating from a position of power, power is abused to the greatest extent. And again, in the name of religion, in the name of Islam, or in the name of God. That's the unfortunate part of it. So when you are talking about hope, I think there is a lot of hope. The Western world still, in many ways, when you measure it by the standards of Prophet Muhammad, who established the first republic, back in 622. Medina means the republic. That's not the name of a city, but people treat it as the name of the city. So the Prophet established the first republic, which later they all added using the Greek republic with the Farabi republic, which is the utopia version of it, and blending the concept of the philosopher king with the prophet philosopher king concept, that reason, revelation, and all that can go together. Based on those standards, the Western world in many ways exceed the standards of moral superiority, which is wonderful. And I'm talking about the society, the Western societies. I'm not talking about governments. That's a whole different story. So by those standards, we have countries like Denmark, New Zealand, the other Scandinavian countries that are much more Quranic. In contrast to what I said earlier, that the Muslim world had become a little too biblical and for the wrong reasons. So, if there is any hope, I hope that the Western world will come to the realization that you can't fly with one wing. You have to flap both. And that is the logos and the mythos, bringing them together. And I think if there is any salvation, it will be in that. That sure, we can rely on a lot of technology and all the great advancements for which all humanity must be very, very appreciative for how much it makes the world a more livable place. However, we can't give up on our racist mentalities. And the race in the Western world is defined geographically. Like, for instance, in Europe, if you live 10 meters to the west of somebody to the east, that Western person is considered superior. The French compared to the Germans compared to the Poles, and the Poles compared to the Russian. And it keeps going like that. So it's very geographical, very directional in that sense. And then when it leaves the geography, then the layers of religion comes in there. Many Afghans are wondering in these days that after the big fiasco last August in Kabul, when the government fell, um, and the world was so receptive and welcoming Afghan refugees, and giving them all kinds of help and assistance and all that. And then comes February 24th and the attack on Ukraine. And all of a sudden, the Afghans are not anywhere in anybody's radar. They have been completely forgotten. They apply for asylum and for all kinds of things. They say, like, look, while we are busy here helping the Ukrainians, you guys have to wait. And we have received the same kind of a treatment for how the Haitians are treated when they come to the southern border versus Latinos. So we have that racist attitude still with us. And this is not unique to the West. Every world community is racist to some extent. But because we have so much power, when we wield that power with a touch of racism in it, it can be very dangerous in some cases, as it could also be very helpful. So I hope that the West becomes detribalized in the real sense of it. And unfortunately, the detribalization of the Quran, of that message, fell by the wayside and it didn't work. And I hope that the West will do that, and that they will be able to convince the rest of the world that there's no such a thing as Western democracy. Democracy is a yearning of the human soul and of the human spirit to live peacefully, without war, without all these terrible tragedies that are inflicted on the human soul everywhere. That if we can look at it that way and keep, in a way, the spirit of the establishment of the United Nations right after World War II, or rather the European War II, then I think there is hope. But I think we are kind of falling victims here in the West. We are falling victims to our greed. We are not counting billionaires anymore. Perhaps many of those are trillionaires now. We have to coin new words for them. And that greed is kind of blinding them to a reality where they can see the humanity in humanity.
Well, I want to thank you for such an illuminating, brilliant, the images, thought-provoking. There's so much I'm needing to digest from our conversation. Just really amazing. I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to have a conversation with you, Dr. Stanizai. Really
Thank you
incredible.
for inviting me, and thank you for making me
Yeah.
part of the conversation. I probably did most of the talking, but I learned a whole lot from your silence, as well as from your very deep questions, and perhaps you can even call it questioning. But I think that interactiveness that is between the human and the divine is also there between the human and the human. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're very,
Thank
very
you.
welcome. Thank you.